Hello, this is GardenSerenity back with another episode of The Sinking City. I'm here with my wife Ada Lily, and she's going to be reading more stories from the Necronomicon for you.
Hey everybody, it's Ada Lily. So, the last time I did a video, I said I would talk about the last story I read, which was The Color Out of Space. Now, that story was just. I liked it because I liked the supernatural kind of alien aspect to it and how it seemed that they went back home after basically draining the life out of that place for years. But I think one of the things that I was more weirded out by or curious about is why they would stay. Like, I understand that Nahum, that was his life, that was his family. He had all these, like, semi successes with people being scared. But at the same time, after a while, I don't think if I could have been like Ami and went back, I feel like there would have been like too much wrong there. And after his children and his wife had seemed to be going mad from this place, personally, I just think it would have been better to kind of like not go back. But I think out of all the stuff that could be considered horror that I've read so far, this is definitely one of the top stories for that. I With reading Lovecraft stories so far, as I've never read them before, I say that a lot of them, it they definitely give a lot to think about. Sometimes I'm wondering what happened, and I kind of wish there was a lot more to the story. But I guess that's the point, to use your imagination. And sometimes my imagination's fun. Like at the end of one of the other stories that I've read, I want to believe that the guy got what was coming to him because he kept going deeper and deeper into that place. And clearly, it was made for some sort of lizard like creature and whatnot. And in this one, I actually kind of feel a bit sad for the family. It's like their entire lives, everything had been affected by this meteor dropping out of space and clearly having something in it that was poisoning them and attacking them and eventually dragging them down to the well, for example, and stealing their life force piece by piece. But that is my impression so
These have
far.
been here a
So,
while.
without further ado, the story I will be reading today is called In the Vault.
These have been here a while.
There is nothing more absurd, as I view it, than that conventional association of the homely and the wholesome, which seem to pervade the psychology
Where does
of the
one find a
multitude.
miniature coffin like this?
Mention of bucolic Yankee setting, a bungling and thick fibered village undertaker, and a careless mishap in a tomb, and no average reader can be brought to expect more than a hearty albeit grotesque phase of comedy. God knows, though, that the prosy tale which George Birch's death permits me to tell has in its aspects besides which some of our darkest tragedies are light. Birch acquired a limitation and changed his business in 1881, yet never discussed the case when he could avoid it. Neither did his old physician, Dr. Davis, who died years ago. It was generally stated that the affliction and shock were a result of an unlucky slip whereby Birch had locked himself for 9 hours in the recovering tomb of Peck Valley Cemetery, escaping for 9 hours in the receiving tomb. Sorry,
Life can be cruel.
I accidentally read the same line.
Would have made a better father proud.
So we were there where he escaped he had locked himself for 9 hours in the receiving
What the?
tomb of Peck Valley
No,
Cemetery,
my
escaping
head.
only
Ah,
by crude and
damn it.
disastrous
I
mechanical
can't.
means.
I
But
can't.
while this much was undoubtedly true, there were other and blacker things which the man used to whisper to me in his drunken delirium toward the last. He confided in me because I was his
Hey!
doctor,
Hey, let me
and
out!
because he probably felt the need of confiding in someone else after Davis died. He was a bachelor, wholly without relatives. Birch, before 1881, had been the village undertaker of Peck Valley and was a very callous and primitive specimen, such as even as such specimens go. The practices I heard attributed to him would be unbelievable today, at least in a city, and even Peck Valley would have shuddered a bit had it known the easy ethics of its mortuary artists in such manners as ownership of costly quote unquote laying out apparel invisible beneath the casket's lid, and the degrees of dignity to be maintained in composing and adapting the unseen members of lifeless tenants to containers not always calculated with sublimest accuracy. Most distinctly, Birch was lax, insensitive, and professionally undesirable. Yet I still think he was not an evil man. He was merely crass of fiber and function, thoughtless, careless, liquorish, as his easily avoidable accident proves, and without that modicum of imagination which holds the average citizen within certain limits fixed by taste. Just where to begin Birch's story I can hardly describe, since I am no practiced teller of tales. I suppose one should start in the cold December of 1880, when the ground froze and the cemetery delvers found they could dig no more graves till
The
spring.
biggest mirror exhibition in the history of
Fortunately, the
Oakmont,
village was small
including
and the death
Master
rate low,
Randall's finest
so that it was
creations.
possible to give all of Birch's
His mirror
inanimate
into a
charges
museum
a
of
temporary
vintage
haven
mirrors
in the single
collected over many
antiquated
decades.
receiving tomb. The undertaker grew doubly lethargic in the bitter weather, and seemed to outdo even himself in carelessness. Never did he knock together flimsier and ungainlier caskets, nor disregard more flagrantly the needs of the rusty lock on the tomb door, which he slammed open and shut with such nonchalant abandon. At last the spring fall came, and graves were laboriously prepared for the 9 silent harvests of the grim reaper which waited in the tomb. Birch, though dreading the bother of removal and interment, began his transference one disagreeable April morning,
There.
but ceased before
As
noon
long as this
because of a
mirror
heavy
stays
rain that
whole,
seemed to
you will
irritate
be
his horse,
safe, baby boy.
after having laid but
Safe
one body to
while
its
I
permanent
find a way to
rest.
free you.
That was Darius Peck, the nonagerian whose grave was not far from the tomb. Birch decided that he would begin the next day with little old Matthew
These
Fenner,
rites,
whose
they
grave
might buy
was
me
also
time.
nearby, but actually postponed the matter for 3 days, not getting to work until Good Friday the 15th. Being without superstition, he did not heed the day at all, though ever afterwards he refused to do anything of importance on that
I will get you
fateful
out, Hammond.
6th day of the
There
week.
has to be a way.
Certainly, the events
Time
of
to
that
piece
evening
this one
greatly
together.
changed George Birch. On the afternoon of Friday, April 15th, then Birch set for the tomb with horse and wagon to transfer the body of Matthew Fenner.
These rites, they
That
might buy me
that
time.
he was not perfectly sober, he subsequently admitted, though he
There.
had not then
As
taken
long as
to the
this mirror
wholesale
stays
drinking by
whole,
which he
you
later
will be
tried to forget
safe,
certain
baby
things.
boy.
He
safe
was just
while
dizzy
I
and
find a way to
careless enough
free
to
you.
annoy his sensitive horse,
I will get
which,
you
as he
out.
drew it
I mean,
viciously up
there
at the
has to be
tomb,
a way.
neighed and pawed and tossed its head, much as on that former occasion when the rain had seemingly vexed it.
I will get you
The day
out.
was
I mean,
clear,
there has to be a
but a
way.
high wind had sprung up, and Birch was glad to get to shelter as he unlocked the iron door and entered the side hill vault.
There. As long as this
Another
mirror
might
stays
not have
whole,
relished the damp,
you will be
odorous
safe,
chamber with
baby
the eight
boy.
carelessly placed
These
coffins,
rights,
but
they
Birch in
might
those
buy me
days wasn't
time.
sensitive and was only concerned in getting the right coffin for the right grave. He had not forgotten the criticism aroused when Hannah Bixby's relatives, wishing to transport her body to the cemetery in the city whither they had moved, found the casket of Judge Capwell beneath her stone. The light was dim, but Birch's sight was
I will
good,
get you
and he
out.
did
I
not
mean,
get
there has to be a
Asaph
way.
Sawyer's coffin by mistake, although it was very similar. He had, indeed, made that coffin for Matthew Finner,
These
but had
rights,
cast it aside
they
at
might buy me time.
last as too awkward and flimsy, in a fit of curious
There.
sentimentality,
As
aroused by
long as this
recalling
mirror
how
stays
kindly and
whole,
generous the
you
little
will
old
be
man
safe,
had been
baby
to him
boy.
during his
Safe
bankruptcy
while I find a
five
way
years
to
before.
free you.
Bethany set up
He
some
gave
sort of
old
barrier
Matt
to
the
buy
very
time while she
best
tries to free Hammond.
his skill could
I
produce,
could
but
remove it
was
by
thirsty
destroying her
enough to
ritual
save the
mirror.
rejected specimen and to use it when Asaph Sawyer died of malignant fever. Sawyer was not a lovable man, and many stories were told of his almost inhuman vindictiveness and tenacious memory for wrongs real or fancied. To him, Birch had felt no compunction in assigning the carelessly made coffin, which he now pushed out of the way in his quest for the Finner casket. It was just as he had recognized old Matt's coffin that the door slammed to in the wind, leaving him in a dusk even deeper than before. The narrow transom admitted only the feeblest of rays, and the overhead ventilation funnel virtually none at all,
Life can be
so that
cruel.
he was reduced to a profane fumbling as he made his halting way among the long boxes towards the latch. In this funeral twilight, he rattled the rusty handles, pushed at the iron panels, and wondered why the massive portal had grown so suddenly recalcitrant. In this twilight, too, he began to realize the truth and to shout loudly, as if his horse outside could do more than neigh an unsympathetic reply. For the long neglected latch was obviously broken, leaving the careless
Somebody's been
undertaker
doing their
trapped in the
homework.
vault, a victim of his own oversight. The thing must have happened at about 3:30 in the afternoon. Birch, being by temperament phlegmatic and practical, did not shout long, but proceeded to grope about for some tools which he recalled seeing in a corner of the tomb. It is doubtful whether he was touched at all by the horror and exquisite weirdness of his position, but the bald fact of imprisonment so far from the daily paths of men was enough to exasperate him thoroughly. His day's work was sadly interrupted, and unless chance presently brought some rambler hither, he might have to remain all night or longer. The pile of tools soon reached, and a hammer and chisel selected. Birch returned over the coffins to the door. The air had begun to be exceedingly unwholesome, but to this detail he paid no attention, as he toiled, half by feeling at the heavy and corroded metal of the latch, He would have given much for a lantern or a bit of candle, but lacking these, bungled semi-sightlessly as best as he might. When he perceived that the latch was hopelessly unyielding, at least to such meager tools and under such tenebrous conditions as these, Birch glanced about for other possible points of escape. The vault had been dug from a side hill, so that the narrow ventilation funnel in the top ran through several feet of the earth, making this direction utterly useless to consider. Over the door, however, the high slit-like transom in the brick facade gave
Oh,
promise of
no,
possible
no. You
enlargement
can't have him.
to a
I
diligent
won't let
worker,
you.
and the
You can't
coffin
take the
niches
mirror.
on the
You hear me?
sides
Bethany,
and rear,
calm down.
which Birch seldom
Please. I mean you no
took the
harm.
trouble to use, afforded
No,
no ascent
you
to the
won't take
space
my
above the
child.
door.
Not again.
Only the
I won't
coffins
let
themselves
you.
remained as potential stepping
It's
stones,
okay.
and
We
he
can talk
considered
about this.
these,
I know the mirror's
he
important to you.
speculated
It's my
on the
son.
best mode of arranging them.
My son.
3 coffin heights,
His
he reckoned, would
soul,
permit
his
him
very being trapped
to
in the
reach the
mirror.
transom, but he could do better
Cold,
with 4.
hungry,
The boxes were fairly
scared
even
for
and could be
decades.
piled up like blocks,
It's
so he began to compute
okay. It's
how
so hard to understand.
he might
His
most stably
body
use
is dead,
the 8
but his soul is
to rear
frozen
a
in
scalable
glass,
platform for him.
unable to move on or
As he
return
planned,
without help. Oh,
he could not but
Francis
wish
thought this
that
was
the units
merciful.
of
Oh,
his
the
contemplated
wretch.
staircase had been more securely made. Whether he
What
had
do you need to do
imagination
then?
enough to wish
I can call
they were
Hammond
empty
back
is strongly
into
to be
his own
doubted.
body.
Finally, he
Don't judge
decided to
me.
lay a base of 3
This this
parallel
may
with the
seem
wall to
unnatural,
place
but
upon this 2
but we will
layers
be
of 2
together.
each, and upon
Everything
these
is
a
ready.
single
I'm
box to
sure it
serve
will work.
as the
I only need to
platform.
break the mirror to
This
release him.
arrangement could be
I
ascended with
can't
a
go back
minimum
empty
of
handed.
awkwardness
And I
and would
won't leave
furnish
without my
the
son.
desired height. Better still, though, he would utilize only 2
It's
boxes of
crazy,
the
Bethany.
base to
Even
support
if it
the
worked, it wouldn't be
superstructure,
right. I'm
leaving one
taking the
free
mirror to
to be
Robert.
piled
No,
on top
you
in
can't.
case the
I won't
actual
let
feat of
you.
escape required an even greater altitude. And so, the prisoner toiled in the twilight, cleaving the unresponsive remnants of mortality with little ceremony as his miniature Tower of Babel rose course by course. Several of the coffins began to split under the stress of handling, and he planned to save the stoutly built casket of little Matthew Finner for the top, in order that his feet might have as a as certain a surface as possible. In the semi-gloom, he trusted mostly to touch to select the right one, and indeed came upon it almost by accident, since it tumbled into his hands as if through some odd volition, after he had unwittingly placed it beside another on the 3rd layer. The tower at length finished, and his aching arms rested by a pause, during which he sat on the bottom step of his grim device. Birch cautiously ascended with his tools and stood abreast of the narrow transom. The borders of the space were entirely of brick, and there seemed little doubt that he could shortly chisel away enough to allow his body to pass. As his hammer blows began to fall, the horse outside whined in a tone which may have been encouraging and may have been mocking. In either case, it would have been
I tracked
appropriate,
down the mirror.
for the
Is that a
unexpected
chase?
tenacity of the
Excellent.
easy-looking
Hand
brickwork
it over, please.
was surely
You
a
have
sardonic
rendered my family and its noble
commentary
bloodline a
on the
great
vanity
service,
of
Mr.
mortal
Reed.
hopes,
Here,
and
your
the
reward,
source of a task
earned in
whose
full, I
performance
might
deserved
add.
every possible stimulus.
So, now you have the mirror. What's your plan?
To find
Dusk
Hammond a
fell,
body fit
and
for a
found Birch
true-born
still
Throgmorton.
toiling. He
Ponder
worked
Belly
largely
seems an
by
appropriate
feeling
choice.
now, since newly gathered clouds hid the moon.
I'm not in the
And
mood
though
for chit
progress
chat,
was
Mr.
still
Reed.
slow, he felt heartened at the extent of his encroachments on the top and bottom of the aperture. He could, he was sure, get out by midnight, though it is characteristic of him that this thought was untinged with eerie implications. Undisturbed by oppressive reflections on the time, the place, and the company beneath his feet, he philosophically chipped away at the stony brickwork, cursing when a fragment hit him in the face, and laughing when one struck the increasingly excited horse that pawed near the cypress tree. In the in time, the hole grew so large that he ventured to try his body in it now, and then, shifting about so that the coffins beneath him rocked and creaked, he would he would not, he found, have to pile another on his platform to make the proper height for the hole that was on exactly the right level to use as soon as his size would permit. It must have been midnight at least when Birch decided he could get through the transom. Tired and perspiring despite many rests, he descended to the floor and sat a while on the bottom box to gather strength for the final wriggle and leap to the ground outside. The hungry horse was neighing repeatedly and almost uncannily, and he vaguely wished it would stop. He was curiously unelated over his impending escape and almost dreaded the exertion, for his form had the indolent stoutness of early middle age. As he remounted the splitting coffins, he felt his weight very poignantly, especially when, upon reaching the topmost one, he heard that aggravated crackle which bespeaks the wholesale rendering of wood. He had, it seemed, planned in vain when choosing the stoutest coffin for the platform, for no sooner was his full bulk upon it than the rotting lid gave way, dousing him 2 feet down on a surface which he did not care to imagine. Maddened by the sound or by the stench which billowed forth even to the open air, the waiting horse gave a scream that was too frantic for a neigh, and plunged madly off through the night, the wagon rattling
Poor man was
crazily
trying to
behind it.
escape, but met his end after a single
Birch,
savage
in his
attack.
ghastly situation, was now too low for an easy scramble out of the enlarged transom, but gathered his energies for a determined try. Clutching the edges of the aperture, he sought to pull himself up when he noticed a peer retardation in the form of an apparent drag in both his ankles. In another moment, he feared for the first time that night, for the struggle as he would, he could not shake clear the unknown grasp which held his feet in relentless captivity. Horrible pains as of savage men shot through his calves, and in his mind was a vortex of fright mixed with an unquenchable materialism that suggested splinters, loose nails, and or some other attribute of a breaking wooden box. Perhaps, he screamed. At any rate, he kicked and squirmed frantically and automatically whilst his consciousness was almost eclipsed in a half swoon. Instinct guided him in his wriggle through the transom and in the crawl which followed his jarring thud on the damp ground. He could not walk, it appeared, and the emerging moon must have witnessed a horrible sight as he dragged his bleeding ankles towards the cemetery lodge, his fingers clawing the black mold in brainless haste, and his body responding with that maddening slowness from which one suffers when chased by the phantoms of nightmare. There was evidently, however, no pursuer, for he was alone and alive when Armington, the lodge keeper, responded to his feeble clawing at the door. Armington helped Birch to the outside of a spare bed and sent his little son Edwin for Dr. Davis. The afflicted man was fully conscious, but would say nothing of any consequence, merely muttering such things as, "Oh, my ankles! Let go!" or "Shut the tomb! Shut the tomb!" Then the doctor came with his medicine case and asked this question and removed the patient's outer clothing, shoes, and socks. The wounds for both ankles were frightfully lacerated about the Achilles tendons, seemed to puzzle the old physician greatly, and finally almost to frighten him. His questioning grew more than medically tense, and his hands shook as he dressed the mangled members, binding them as if he wished to get the wounds out of sight as quickly as possible. For an impersonal doctor, Davis's ominous and awestruck cross-examination became very strange indeed, as he sought to drain from the weakened undertaker every last detail of his horrible experience. He was oddly anxious to know if Birch were sure, absolutely sure, of the identity of that top coffin of the pile, how he had chosen it, how he had been certain of it as the Finner coffin in the dark, and how he had distinguished it from the inferior duplicate coffin of vicious Asaph Sawyer. Would the firm Finner casket have caved in so readily? Davis, an old-time village practitioner, had of course seen both at their respective funerals, as indeed he had attended both Finner and Sawyer in their last illnesses. He had even wondered at Sawyer's funeral how the vindictive farmer had managed to lie straight in a box so closely to that of the diminutive Finner. After a full 2 hours, Dr. Davis left, urging him to insist at all times that his wounds were due entirely to loose nails and splintering wood. What else, he added, could have ever in any case be proved or believed? But it would be well to say as little as could be said, and to let no other doctor treat the wounds. Birch heeded this advice all the rest of his life until he told me his story, and when I saw the scars, ancient and whitened as they were, I agreed he was wise in doing so. I always find it lame, but I think his thinking processes, once so phlegmatic and logical, had become ineffaceably scarred, and it was pitiful to note his reaction to certain chance allusions such as Friday, tomb, coffin, and words of less obvious concatenation. His frightened horse had gone home, but
I'm
his
guessing
frightened
it
wits had
wasn't
never quite
suicide.
did that. He changed his business, but something always preyed upon him. It may have been just fear, and it may have been fear mixed with a queer, belated sort of remorse for bygone cruelties. His drinking, of course, only aggravated what he sought to alleviate. When Dr. Davis left Birch that night, he had taken a lantern and gone to the old receiving tomb. The moon was shining on the scattered brick fragments and marred facade, and the latch of the great door yielded readily to a touch from outside. Steeled by old ordeals in dissecting rooms, the doctor entered and looked about,
I haven't known you
stifling the
long, but you mean
nausea of
so much
mind
to
and
me.
body that everything in sight and smell included. He cried aloud, and a little later gave a gasp that was
The door won't
more
budge.
terrible than a cry. Then he fled back to the lodge and broke all the rules of his calling by rousing and shaking his patient and hurling at him a succession of shuddering whispers that seared into the bewildered ears like hissing of vitriol. It was Asif's coffin, Birch, just as I thought. I knew his teeth, with the front ones missing on the upper jaw. Never, for God's sake, show those wounds. The body was pretty badly gone, but if I ever saw vindictiveness on any face or former face, you you know what a fiend he was for revenge, how he ruined old Raymond 30 years after their boundary suit, and how he stepped on the puppy that snapped at him a year ago last August. He was the devil incarnate, Birch, and I believe his eye for an eye fury could beat time and death. God, his rage. I'd hate to have it aimed at me. Why did you do Why did you do it, Birch? He was a scoundrel, and I don't blame you for giving him a cast aside coffin, but you always did go too damn far. Well enough to skimp on the thing in some way, but you knew what a little man old Fenner was. I'll never get the picture out of my head as long as I live. You kicked hard, for Asif Common was on the floor. His head was broken in, and everything tumbled about. I've seen sights before, but there was one thing too much here. An eye for an eye. Great heavens, Birch, but you got what you deserved. The skull turned my stomach, but the other was worse. Those ankles cut neatly off to fit Matthew Fenner's cast aside coffin.
Don't do
Wow.
anything stupid, newcomer.
I kind
And keep your
of,
hands where I can see 'em.
with this story, figured that he had somehow been on the other man's coffin. Not just because they kind
I
of
know why
mentioned
you
it a
wanted
bit
this case
much,
cracked.
but
Found some
because
clues in Becker's house. And you were close, weren't you?
it
dare
was
you.
obviously an issue, and then
He,
the fact that he was like this
he was
careless
special.
talisman, and
A man you meet
they
only
never
once in
mentioned
life.
how tall
He
Asif
understood
Sawyer
me.
was.
I
So
won't stop until I find those
can't
who did
say
it.
in this
I'm
one he
sorry
didn't
for your
get what he
loss, Sam.
deserved.
And don't worry, I'm a private
After all,
eye.
he
Emphasis on
apparently
the private.
Thank you, Charles.
had
I
cut off the
appreciate it.
guy's ankles to fit this other
There's a
coffin.
link between all the
And
victims.
if the guy
I
was
found
this
these
horrible
cards
in
in each
life,
house.
and
Photography
they
club
thought that he
membership.
could be this
They
horrible
all
in
had
death
them.
as well,
Yeah.
I can see it
Seems like a
being
good place to
something that
investigate.
Thank you, Reed. I knew
Kind
you'd find
of
something. I might pay this club a
the
visit. See if there's
George
anyone
Birch
who has
in
an
this
issue with them.
case had deserved.
I got those
I
photos
mean,
you
I
wanted.
understand if
You
you
got my
don't want to do your
compensation.
work,
Terrific,
or you don't
thank
want to
you.
do a great job
Here,
at your
take
work,
this.
Some of
or
these
something
were
like that,
pretty horrible.
but he was
I hope you find the killer.
disrespecting
Me too, Reed. Me
the
too.
dead, and pretty much, and
Take care.
I'm wondering how he really got it to, like, during the funeral, that he didn't quite, that no one saw it, I think is what I'm trying to say. But then again, if it was like a closed casket and stuff, which given the time period it probably was, it's just one of those things where, why, like, he could have given a bigger and just as crappy coffin if he wanted. And so with him possibly getting these wounds on his ankles and being told never to show them again and everything like that, I honestly think, though, maybe he should have, like, maybe he deserved more than just his ankles almost being completely cut off by someone that he had wronged in death. But I will definitely have to say that is, I like that one. I like that one a lot. It was fun. It was it had a good lesson at the end, and it's just like, don't do something without expecting it to come back on you.
Alright, that's going to do it for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.